Murney Tower Museum. You received an email from Paul Van Ness, and in that he did talk about the slogan contests that they are holding. They want you to come up with some catchy slogan related to the Murney Tower, and incredible prizes are available, no doubt. So in order to enter into this contest, you're going to use Eventbrite, and you register for the event that way. The other thing is, oh, sorry, you don't register for that. Forget that last few sentences. You have a meet and greet coming up though. Now that'll be next Wednesday night, 7 o'clock on Zoom. And that's where you're going to join up. You're going to go to Eventbrite and you're going to register. And the meet and greet, let me just read what I was told to read here. Leadership team will be hosting an online event meet and greet. Come and join us on Wednesday, April the 21st at 7 p.m. for an engaging conversation about the beloved museum. Nice touch. Now, what it'll be is a Q&A and just a discussion. You can chat with Tabitha, who is the director, there she is, tonight's speaker, and Sim Erdogan, who is our manager, and then some of the other staff, and just a conversation about the museum, where it's going, what's happening. I know that they've got some stuff planned for outdoors this spring and summer, and a lot of activity going on there. You find all this information, of course, when you read Limelight. As well, if you've dug down a bit, they've got a very good newsletter that comes out periodically, a monthly newsletter. So I would encourage you to do these things. Now, if you're asking, hey, how do I even get over to them? Send an email, okay? Send an email to manager@murneytower.com. Okay, and I'm sure that Tabitha or someone will put this in that little thing, the chat. Somebody's put a chat up already, probably already onto that. That's about it. That's all that I have to say. And I think we're going to have a very, very interesting talk tonight. And then we'll have another talk months from now. And we're hoping to have something going on around June the 6th, the John A. ceremony. Keep your eye on Limelight to figure out about that. And we're already working on the fall program. Duncan is doing a great job in that area. He may want to say something at the end of the meeting tonight. Okay, so that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over now to our manager in charge of these presentations, Duncan McDowell.
Thank you, Vincent. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth in our spring series of lectures at the Kingston Historical Society. How nice it is to hear that word spring. It has real meaning today, and we're certainly looking forward to being able to put post-pandemic in front of that in the near future. We're working on that for the fall. Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Tabitha Renaud. She brings to us an interesting and I think very timely message. In recent years, Canada has been through and continues to go through a process of truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples, a process that has been both painful and illuminating. As a society, we have addressed past wrongs, residential schools, the scoop, land claims, to name just a few of the key issues that have cumulatively obliged us to learn to communicate with each other in ways that have been absent in previous generations. We have a long way to go in this process of dialogue and accommodation, but I think there has been progress. Here in Kingston, for instance, you can now study the Mohawk and Inuktitut languages at Queen's, where there are now also programs in Aboriginal history and art. An Office of Indigenous Initiatives has been mandated to expand these opportunities. On a day-to-day basis, Indigenous students at Queen's now have the Four Directions Center where they can meet with each other and at the same time invite non-natives to share in their culture. In short, we have now finally talking to each other, and for me, this foretells a very much happier future for this nation. For the historian, this also begs the question, how did we communicate in the past? In popular culture, the movies would lead us to believe that the Indians all miraculously understood English. James Fenimore Cooper's Mohegans apparently comprehended everything that Leatherstocking said to them. Well, of course, this was hardly the case. A remarkable historical oversight, since the understandings arrived at by natives and white settlers in these early years of contact in many ways echo down into the present. This conundrum is what intrigues Dr. Renaud. How did we communicate in these early years? Now, Tabitha is a remarkable young scholar. She holds a doctorate in history from Queen's, has taught there. It is now a course coordinator at the university. En route, Tabitha has acquired that crucial historian skill, one I have to say is sadly missing in so many academic historians, of carrying history to the people, of making history relevant to the issues of the day. She has been active in the promotion of Kingston's history, a sense of heritage, doing everything from organizing floats for heritage parades on through to acting as director of the Murney Tower Museum. She sits on boards of heritage organizations, builds websites, and generally brings an infectious enthusiasm to everything she turns her mind to. So without further ado, I will ask Tabitha to take us back to those early momentous encounters when Europeans and natives first asked the question, who are you? Welcome, Tabitha.
I love it. Thank you so much, Duncan. Thank you. Hi, everyone. All right, before I start, I just want to let everybody know that we are recording this right now. So if there's anyone that doesn't want to be recorded, you can please just turn your video off and then we won't catch your face. And of course, another thing that I'd really like to do before we start is a land acknowledgement. I think it's extremely important, not just in general in life, but for this topic in particular, I would be remiss. So, you know, here in Kingston, we live and work on the lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people. And, you know, I want us to keep them in mind tonight, and I'm going to keep them in my heart as I speak tonight. Very, very important. But for those that don't know me, my name is Tabitha, and I am absolutely thrilled to talk to you tonight about this topic. It's something that people have wondered about. They've asked so many questions about. And honestly, it is a really fascinating topic. I should say, though, that the cover photo, hopefully, oh, the video hasn't started. Yeah, let's get that video started if that's okay. Bless your heart, my dear. Let's start the video. Here it is, guys. All right. Lovely, lovely. Just one sec here. Sorry, I got to get my script. Sorry, here we go. Thank you. All right, now we've got the video. So the cover photo you're looking at right now was painted by Francis Back, but most of the paintings you're going to be looking at over the next little while are actually from the 1500s. They were painted during contact. An artist named John White was asked to document the Indigenous world and to share that with Europe, what he was seeing. And so these are 500-year-old paintings that I'm sharing with you tonight. And don't worry, the slideshow isn't broken. We're going to be spending about a minute per slide, just so you can appreciate this art. I'd also like to say before I start that I started this project over 10 years ago. So some of the language in this talk tonight is out of date. We're all still learning and growing. So I apologize if some of my terminology is dated tonight. All right, so without further ado, let's rock and roll here. All right, so my PhD looked at how communication functioned during the earliest encounters between the English and Indigenous people in North America. So I looked specifically at the 1500s in what is now today Canada and the United States. I looked at experimental forms of communication like miming and drawing in the sand. Quite often, European explorers recorded that Indigenous people were telling them these complex passages of information right when they first met. And so I had a lot of questions about that. I mean, how did that even work? How effective was that? And so my work looked specifically at English examples. But however, looking over this at the last 10 years or so, I've seen the same patterns in French or Spanish or in any of these encounters from the 1500s. But I looked specifically at the Elizabethan period. So that's when Shakespeare was alive. That's the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And these expeditions take place in the 1570s and the 1580s. I've got 3 case studies I'm going to be taking examples from tonight. The first one is the Frobisher expeditions. These expeditions went to the Arctic and they encountered the South Baffin Inuit in the 1570s. They were looking for the Northwest Passage, but then they got distracted. They started mining for gold. It ended up not being real gold. And then there was a huge scandal and bankruptcy. But there were 3 expeditions. And the last one was apparently the largest fleet that ever went to the Arctic. The second case study is the Davis expeditions. These also went to the Arctic and they encountered the Greenland Inuit. This was the 1580s. Also, it's 3 expeditions looking for the Northwest Passage. This was 10 years after Frobisher, and these voyages were not as famous as Frobisher, but it is where we get the name the Davis Strait. The last case study we're going to look at is a very big one. It's the Roanoke encounters. And this was with the Carolina Algonquins. So this took place in present-day North Carolina in the 1580s. There were 4 expeditions. There was a serious attempt to colonize by the English. And you may know this as the famous Walter Raleigh case study, or the Lost Colony of Roanoke. And these voyages happened at the exact same time as the Davis voyages. Now, I'm often asked, what sources could you possibly use to figure this out? How could somebody possibly study this? Well, to explain, I'm using mostly the journals of the European explorers. Most of these are widely available in print. They were actually written and published right at the time these expeditions were happening, either for promotional purposes or to preserve the history because they knew it was important, or, to sell and make money off of travel writing, which was a popular genre. Now, these journals, some of them read like ship logs, some of them read more like a diary of the person's experience. I also use some Inuit oral history, other documents, archaeology, linguistics, sign language studies, and various ethno-historical sources. So, as you can imagine, very little study has been done related to this early phase with miming. There's an assumption here that the evidence is just way too fragmentary, that it's been lost to the mists of time, right? And I get where that impression comes from. Explorers often don't describe how they're communicating, or if they do, signing is just vaguely alluded to. Quite often in the journals, you'll just see it written as, he said. And I'll give you some real quotations here, right from the journals. Quote, "They told us." "He said." "We told them." "It was made known by signs that," or "with signs we understood that." Now, historians haven't really explored this issue much before. They tend to just gloss over it. A verb keeps coming up in their work all the time, and it's the verb gleaned. Basically the idea that information was somehow gleaned off of people. And so I had a lot of questions about this gleaning. But before we dig into this, I want to clarify a few things. The title of this presentation isn't really fair. The title is Without Words, but there wasn't actually a binary of with words and without words. People were learning simple nouns from the very first moments. Also, I'm not trying to suggest that spoken language is superior to sign language or that nonverbal communication can't be effective. All right, so what did I find in these journals? If you do a close reading of these texts, you'll actually see sometimes they do describe the gestures they're using, but more often they'll be acts of demonstration. For example, an Inuk demonstrates to the English exactly how you use a dog sled, or he takes the time to show exactly how you use specific tools. The English would create these little vocabulary lists that we now call dictionaries. And basically the two sides would demonstrate words to each other that they would try to put in a vocabulary list. Also, the English would try to use drawings. They'd either draw in the dirt or they would try to write something on paper. A really famous example in school was, for the French context, was Cartier having locals draw, on the ground to kind of show a map of the river. Or, Cortez, again in school, famous Spanish example, Cortez using a painting to communicate something that was happening somewhere else. But even in my work in Frobisher, by the second year, Frobisher was trying to use paintings to talk about something that had happened in the past. But there's many, many examples I can go through here. Music, singing, dancing. Like, both sides would use music and dancing to try to convey goodwill and to show friendliness. But also, singing and dancing could be used for intimidation. And quite often, the English report, they had no idea how to interpret local singing and dancing. They would always try to guess at the emotion and the motivation behind things. They'd write things like, we think she's singing sadly, but it's clearly a guess. Both sides would use objects and props. They'd either use them as placeholders, or they'd be trying to make a map, or they'd be trying to communicate 3 people or 3 days. They'd be using visual aids. It'd be part of the demonstration. And sounds were used in all forms, and also symbols as well were used in all forms. But to comment on symbols a bit, because it's complicated. Obviously, for example, the sun means different things in different cultures, and also religious objects or artwork can be very subjective. I do want to mention, I find it absolutely fascinating how little interest the English seem to have in local imagery. They would be looking at Indigenous things and they would say, oh, there seem to be some drawings on this wood. Oh, well, it's just trinkets, or they'd say, oh, look at this. This looks like it could be a bear or a bird. But, they didn't really have that much interest or comment that much on it. And I find that interesting because they just automatically assumed that local people would be obsessed with their symbols and drawings. I also want to mention, I'm going to spend a lot of time tonight on direct communication, but I want to remind you that there was an enormous amount of indirect communication happening. There was body language, outward appearance, gauging emotion and reactions, all this using observation to try to deduce things. It's very important to remember interiority was invisible. What this means was that they usually couldn't see how people were feeling or what people were thinking. The English were constantly guessing at what emotions people were feeling, what they were thinking, and why things were happening. The English would guess, oh, he seems amazed, or they'd say, oh, she seems angry, or, oh, maybe they're scared. They would be guessing, and they would be guessing not only the mood, they'd be guessing the reasons for the mood. And then, of course, repetition is a big one, and reciprocation of sounds. This is really interesting, but when groups sometimes would meet for the first time ever, they would be at a great distance from each other, and they would just sort of reciprocate sort of sounds, not words, just sort of sounds back and forth. And, maybe this was some reassurance that it might be safe to get closer, but it also perhaps seems to have been measuring the consciousness of the other party, both sides trying to measure maybe the humanity of the other group, as they say, make these kind of noises back and forth at each other. I mentioned repetition. They would often repeat things, sometimes 12 times in a row, because they're trying to make sure the other side understands. But I want to point out that just because somebody repeated something 12 times doesn't mean anybody actually understood it correctly. Next, I want to talk about actions. Actions seem fairly obvious, especially because gift giving and trade is so well known and has been studied extensively for decades. But also things like laughing and clapping and crying. I want to spend more time talking about trying to approach or running away. I hadn't really seen much study done in this, but I noticed it was very complicated. When I was reading the journals, it's actually very difficult and very delicate to tell another party that you don't want to engage at this time. So for example, let's say the Inuit in some cases approached the English, but the English didn't want to have a meeting at that time. The English would just keep moving away. and they'd try to gesture no, you know, and just keep moving away. And in some cases, they would be followed for up to 3 hours before local people gave up. And in other cases, let's say when the Inuit came onto English ships, the English had a hard time communicating when they wanted the session to be over, when they wanted it to be done. You know, how do you communicate without words that it's time for somebody to leave? So Davis in his expeditions realized that he could make a real big show of changing activities and ignoring the Inuit, and then they'd maybe get the idea that it was over. For example, he'd pull out the Bible and have everyone sit and worship and just kind of ignore the Inuit until they drifted off. There were a lot of different ways to show goodwill. I'll start talking about games. I noticed 3 different games that were common: wrestling, ball games, and jumping contests. So they were mostly pleasant, but these could become a bit too competitive sometimes. And the English often had ulterior motives. They would be using this to assess the abilities of the other group, you know, just in case. But the Inuit loved playing ball. And the English had their own version of ball, which included tackling and being violent. And they said that the Inuit visibly appeared not to like playing that way. And it makes sense because now our research indicates that the Inuit had women and children and elders playing ball. You know, very different style of game perhaps. And so, you know, we can see that the 2 sides had trouble communicating their rules to each other and might get frustrated if they couldn't express their boundaries. But another way to express goodwill was affection. There'd be hugging and kissing, and local people would rub the arms and the chest and the head of visitors. A really interesting example is John Davis extends his hand out to shake the hand of an Inuk, and the man doesn't quite know what to do with his hand and then kisses it. And Davis thought that was really striking. And I think that's a really cool example. Also for goodwill would be assistance. I think assistance is such a powerful one, and it shows that they could communicate to some extent. Let's say I've got 3 examples here. I saw taking someone's hand to help them across the slippery rocks. You notice that they're not sure-footed, they're nervous, they're having trouble, and you take their hand and help them across the rocks. Or you notice somebody shivering, you know, they're not dressed properly to be in the Arctic, somebody's shivering, and you know, you help keep them warm. And you notice that somebody is having trouble putting their boat in the water. Maybe their boat isn't appropriate to be here, you know, and you notice that they're having trouble putting their boat in the water. So you come over and you help them launch that boat in the water. So I think assistance can be just as powerful as giving gifts. Another powerful thing that doesn't get talked about really is disruption and interruption. It is really difficult to communicate your boundaries without words. And this can lead to, you know, sometimes blunt or drastic actions that can cause tension. So let's say someone's doing something that they don't understand might be dangerous, or they're doing something that's really upsetting you and you can't communicate it because you just don't have the words. You might have to actually grab their hands and stop them physically from doing the action. Or you might actually end up ruining their activity. You might end up stopping or ruining what they are doing because there is no other way to stop it. And this leads us into a discussion of aggression and violence. When communication was failing, things tended to escalate, and both sides could end up just having violence erupt, right? It could happen on either side. We know more about the English's thoughts about this. The English tended to mistake communicating loudly for communicating clearly. So let's say they might fire their weapons in the air to scare someone or to say, enough, stop. A really good example is at Roanoke. This is a famous example. The English realized they're missing a silver cup that they really valued. So they went back to the last village they'd been to, and they demanded verbally that that cup be returned by a certain point or else. And when that didn't work, they assumed that the people in the village had understood their words and were just lying thieves. And so they decided to send a message, and they actually burned that village and they burned the crops because the English assumed at a minimum that a show of force would communicate that they weren't to be trifled with. The problem is just because you communicated something loudly does not mean anyone knows what you're saying or why you're saying it. They can see anger, they can see violence, but that doesn't mean they understand what's going on. An Inuit example. With Davis, the Inuit sometimes couldn't express themselves. They couldn't make their wishes known. They couldn't make things happen. And so sometimes they would start to use their slings to hurl rocks at either Englishmen or the ships. And the English genuinely, they wrote, we don't know why this is happening. We don't know what made them angry. We don't know why they're throwing the rocks at us. And it would actually end up escalating to danger because one sailor was actually hit in the head with a rock. He was knocked off the ship, and I'm not sure he survived. Talking about aggression leads us to talking about kidnapping. We know that Europeans kidnapped people in the hopes of training them as interpreters. But what I've noticed in the journals is all this seemed to do was cause confusion and frighten and anger local communities. An example here. Davis knew that the Inuit had taken his anchor. He knew that the Inuit were sort of trying to strip his ship of metal. They were very interested in metal, and he was having trouble communicating to them, please don't do this. I won't be able to get home. And he was getting increasingly afraid. And so when he loses the anchor and he's afraid he's not going to be able to sail properly, he ends up taking an Inuk hostage. And he's attempting to negotiate some kind of exchange, the man for the anchor. And he says, you've got 1 hour, I'm going to take your friend. And it totally fails. Panic and confusion, it totally fails. And he ends up just needing to leave with the captive. Another famous example is the 5 missing men from the Frobisher expedition. It could be many things, but it could be a possible example of the Inuit kidnapping some Englishmen. And I'll explain. At the beginning of the first Frobisher expedition to meet the South Baffin Inuit, 5 of Frobisher's men leave with an Inuk. They go off with him, and then they don't come back when they're supposed to. And then later the Inuit come back without them. And Frobisher realizes that he can't talk about those men. He has no way to reference it. He's trying 5 over and over again, and he just can't reference this. And he starts to panic. And so, there's a lot of possibilities that could have happened to these folks. But one possibility is they may have been kidnapped by the Inuit. What we do know is, though, that Frobisher kidnapped several people over the next 2 years, trying to arrange a captive exchange to get those men back. All right, now, so I've talked quite a bit about this. I'd like to give you some examples in the actual language of the journals, just so you can kind of see what I've been looking at and how it works. But I do want to mention, I'm not going to be saying this in the Elizabethan pronunciation, and this is a perfect teachable moment to say, just so you know, the Elizabethans did not sound like Victorian elites in a Shakespeare play. They actually sounded more like halfway back to Middle English, in my opinion. If you're familiar with the Canterbury Tales and Chaucer, you might recognize some of those sounds. But obviously, I'm not going to be doing that for you tonight. The first passage I'm going to give you comes from the first encounter between Davis and the Greenland Inuit. This was 1585 at present-day Greenland. All right, quote, when they came on to us, we caused our musicians to play, ourselves dancing and making signs of friendship. They talked with us. Their pronunciation was very hollow through the throat, and their speech such as we could not understand. Only we allured them by friendly embracings and signs of courtesy. At length, one of them, pointing up to the sun with his hand, would presently strike his breast so hard that we might hear the blow. This he did many times before he would trust us. So you can see there many different mechanics of communication. We see music, dancing, miming, all kinds of sounds and actions and body language. We've got affection. And then at the end, we've got a bunch of repetition. Now, pointing to the sun became something the Greenland Inuit and the English would do back and forth whenever they were trying to approach. And maybe this was to reassure each other it was safe to approach. But the English started referring to it as swearing by the sun that they meant no harm. And it's sad. Later, when relations sour, the English actually started using this miming as a trick so they could kidnap local people. But some more examples. Roanoke in 1584, quote, striking on his head and breast and afterwards on ours to show we were all one. So this is an example of how miming might be described in a journal. The English felt that this local man was trying to show they were the same, they were human, by, touching his head, touching their head, touching his head, touching their head, back and forth, right? That was sort of their guess at what he was miming. Frobisher, 1577, quote, "We showed him the picture of his countryman, whose counterfeit we had drawn." So Frobisher actually kidnapped an Inuk, and he was showing him, you know, pictures of what he felt conveyed what had happened the summer before with the 5 missing Englishmen. You know, he thought that these pictures would allow him to reference the past finally about these men. Now, he didn't end up learning anything about the 5 missing men from the pictures, but his men did note, they claimed that the Inuk had really strong reactions to these pictures. And they made a lot of assumptions about those reactions. They said to each other, oh, he doesn't understand this. He thinks the picture's alive. He's talking to it, you know, but we honestly don't know what the man's reactions meant. Just we know the English said they were strong reactions. Another quotation from this year, the same captive, quote, "He set up 5 small sticks round in a circle, one by another, with one small bone placed just in the middlest of all." So again, this is the same captive, and he's put sticks and a bone in some sort of formation on the ground, and the English are watching him do this. And, you know, they're confused. They don't know if the message is for them. They don't know if he's leaving the message for someone else to find later and know what happened to him. They don't know if it's something cultural, if it's a spell. You know, they wonder if he's a conjurer. You know, they're making all kinds of guesses together. But this is a good example because it shows how preconceived notions work. They had a real preoccupation with these 5 missing men, and they often tended to interpret things they saw thinking about the 5 men. So the second somebody noticed there were 5 sticks, it was just decided. They were like, oh, this is about the 5 missing men because there's 5 sticks. But the thing is that I should have mentioned was that this captive was taken from a totally different region, and we don't know if he knew anything about the 5 Englishmen or not. Another really good example, the next year with Frobisher in 1578. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but it's incredible. The English left a small limestone house behind in the Arctic. They actually intentionally built a little limestone house in the English masonry style in the Arctic, and they furnished it in the English style, and they left various items in this house that they thought reflected their culture. They left artwork showing their world, they built an oven, and they left baked bread out, hoping the Inuit would eat it. And they wrote how they thought that this would endear the Inuit to them. A lot of passages are written in different journals about this, but one sentence I think captures it well. Quote, "We also left pictures of men and women on horseback and baked some bread, which we left there for them to see and taste." The last quotation I'm going to give you is from Davis in 1586. An Inuk was demonstrating to Davis's party something, and they weren't quite sure what. They were confused. They were watching him make a fire, and then they started watching him burn things systematically in the fire. And gradually they started to become uncomfortable and said to each other, "I think this is ritualistic." And so Davis wrote, quote, "I willed one of my company to tread out the fire and to spurn it into the sea, which was done to show them that we did contemn their sorcery." So this is what I mentioned about stopping something through disruption. They were getting frightened. They thought it might be witchcraft and that it needed to be stopped immediately. So neither side really was able to understand each other's religion or each other's practices or what any chanting on either side meant. But both sides obviously were practicing their religion in front of each other. The English were praying and worshiping and saying grace in front of local people. These concepts are just extremely hard to express. So now that I've given you a ton of examples, how effective was this? Well, the English often imply that communication was either good or passable, but we have to remember they had a vested interest in presenting communication as effective because they were under pressure to produce results. They needed to show that working with local people was possible because that meant their project was possible and would continue to be funded. Now, in their defense, it's only natural to feel that your gut instinct in the moment is correct, right? A lot of this is rooted in impressionistic guesswork and gut feeling. They were essentially creating a makeshift trade jargon together in the moment. But if we had a third party watching this, they would say, this is just baby talk. This is just baby talk that can only carry out the most simple transactions. When I actually looked closely at the journals, they were saying things like, quote, we could not understand them, or they would allude to the guesswork. They would say, quote, the best conjecture we could make thereof. And we would see in the journals all kinds of frustration and confusion. Things often differ from English understanding, and then the English feel deceived. They never allowed for a miscommunication. They just assumed that people were lying to them. The English often had difficulty acquiring the information they wanted. But you know what I thought was the most compelling evidence? I looked at those little vocabulary lists the explorers were collecting, and I crunched the numbers on it, and I realized 98% of those words collected were easily demonstrated nouns. We're talking about nose and knife. And what's scary is that those were not foolproof. The Inuit dictionaries can be translated today. So we can really see some of the misunderstandings. For example, the English translated something as needle, which today we think means, this is my daughter's. Also, they'd translate boot, and then it would turn out it means leg. So this may not seem a big deal, but basically it indicates that things, the most simple, clear-cut things were actually not even clear-cut. And so a close reading suggests that this communication was makeshift and experimental. It was rooted in impressionistic guesswork. It was based in assumption and circumstantial evidence. And expectations loomed large here. People's preconceived notions, what they were expecting, like both on a personal level and a cultural level, but also the huge cultural differences between all of these groups contributed to tons of misunderstanding. And overall, this is incredibly subjective, both in the creation of messages and understanding the messages. You've probably also noticed that they had very limited ability to deal with conflict resolution. There were limited tools in that toolkit for dealing with even the most minor issues that arose. So quite often in these journals, we'll see that everyone seems to start with good intentions. It's very friendly at first, and things are fine until they're not. Because it's very hard to address grievances. It's hard to resolve tension. Tension continues to build. It's hard to say no when you don't want to do something. It's hard to say you're uncomfortable or scared or express any kind of boundaries. It's hard to make your wishes known without actually moving somebody else's body. Now, Frobisher in the first case study ends up just getting really angry. Davis argues that he's going to do better. He thinks the winning formula here will be very lenient and to think about cultural differences and to never get angry no matter what happens. So he basically, to paraphrase, he tells his men, you know, we need to be very patient. We need to be lenient about everything. Just let them cross your boundaries. Let them take your stuff. Never get angry. You must just be passive and let things happen. So they tried this for a few weeks, but eventually that's really not a feasible long-term strategy. For example, what ends up happening is the Inuit start damaging the ship, and Davis eventually can't take it anymore. He's frightened he won't be able to get home. And so if anything ever wasn't going smoothly, both sides had very little recourse for any kind of problem solving. There's an extra layer of difficulty here I need to mention. The successful transmission of information really can't be verified. And so both sides could think they completely understood each other, but that couldn't be confirmed by them in the moment, and it certainly can't be confirmed by us 500 years later. So I would argue that we can't, take for granted the successful transmission of information. Maybe sometimes they understood correctly, sometimes they didn't, often somewhere in the middle, a mix of both. All right, so now we've come to the so what point of the presentation. You know, what should we be mindful about in these case studies? And, you know, where can we look for areas of misunderstanding? Well, with this sort of communication, I noticed that they really struggled to talk about anything complicated or anything abstract. They had a really hard time talking about anything that happened in another place or time. They were limited to talking about things that were happening in the moment. And so, for example, the English wanted to negotiate the refund of a kayak they had bought earlier. But when they came back, this related to something that had happened in the past. It was too complicated. There's all sorts of cultural things going on here with gift giving and whether a refund is even appropriate, right? So it ended up just being a mess. But also we see that the English couldn't really make future plans. They would set a meeting place and time and expect Indigenous people to be there. And then when they weren't, they just assume they'd been lied to. It never occurs to them that they're not able to communicate about the future under these circumstances. And then, of course, we've talked an awful lot about Frobisher's 5 men who go missing. Basically, it's totally chilling. The second they disappear around a bend in the landscape, it's like he can never speak about them again. Even when he tries to use drawings, it just doesn't clear it up. You're really kind of, stuck on talking about things that are in your direct line of sight. I can't stress that enough, how important line of sight is. There's really no way to know the activities of other people unless you can directly see them. And this explains so much about English paranoia in every single journal. The English were so afraid of Indigenous people. They had no idea what they were doing when they weren't together. And they were always worried when Indigenous people were out of their sight. What are they doing? What are they saying to each other? They were also really afraid because they didn't understand what Indigenous people were saying to each other in front of them. These sort of things, it really, once you think about this stuff, it really starts to explain how things started to go so very wrong. But also, something I noticed I've never seen talked about is there's no way to distinguish really between a death, a disappearance, or a temporary absence if you can't see people. So for example, in 1577, when an Inuk captive dies in England, the English doctor suddenly is hit with the realization he's got to show the body to the other captive or she is never going to know what happened to this man. She's going to assume he's still alive somewhere. So he wrote in his report afterwards, quote, "I showed the body to the woman. She was kept there all the time until the body had been completely covered with earth. I showed her human bones, which had been dug up, and made her understand that we were all to be buried in the same way." So I find that an absolutely powerful example. It's just fascinating. But also, as we've said before, even the most straightforward, clear-cut things can be totally misunderstood. For example, let's say you're pointing at the river. Are you trying to say the word river, the name of the river, the word water, something that's under the water, something that happened there in the past, something that's going to happen in the future? Are you actually pointing at something else, something intangible, or is it over the horizon? Or, what are you pointing at? And it's the same thing with touching your ear. Are you saying ear or hearing or I heard or I understand or maybe even I don't understand? It's the same with pointing at your head and eye. There's just so many possible interpretations. It's also, I'm not sure if you've thought of this before, but it's also really hard to communicate the identity of individuals and communities when you have no words. So is that the person's name, or is it their job, or is it their role? Is it the relationship, So they would assume the identity of people based on the location where they were met. So the English often could not distinguish between people and communities. They didn't know where anybody came from. They just guessed where people came from or where their territory was or how they connected to each other. All of that was conjecture, and the English act like it's fact. And historians have often acted like it's fact when they're looking back at 500 years ago. So the English could see things like respect and affection, or they could see animosity, but the details are harder. So they'd say, is this the man's father, or is this just a respected community elder? And the English would name communities like Roanoke and Croatone, or, the French would name Stadacona and Hochelaga, but we don't actually know who these villages were. We don't understand their relationship to each other or who lived where. And once you start to deconstruct this, it really starts to lead to other possible interpretations of these histories. But before we finish up here, I want to talk about something I always get asked about in the Q&A. There's an assumption that the second we get to the first spoken interpreters, that it solves everything. But it turns out from my research that the earliest phase of spoken language interpreters was full of uncertainty as well. So back to my Roanoke case study, the third case study. They use interpreters at Roanoke at the same time as the miming. They apparently train people in England and use them as interpreters. All right, well, there is so much uncertainty surrounding that. And we realized there were very low standards at the beginning of what constituted an interpreter. We have no idea what training anyone had, how fluent they became. We don't know their natural aptitude to learn languages. We also don't know when, where, or how these interpreters were used. It's never said. So when I'm reading it, I never know if the interpreter's there or not. Also, in some of these situations, we have multiple local languages being used. All these local groups coming together, and the English are watching multiple interpreters, and people are all speaking different languages, and there's all these layers of interpretation that really would have complicated things, but the English just take that for granted and they don't address it. But okay, let's say everybody could speak perfectly. We still don't know the motivations of these interpreters. We don't know at Roanoke, for example, the circumstances of recruitment. We don't know if the Roanoke interpreters were kidnapped, if they volunteered. If they did volunteer, did they understand what they were volunteering for? Were they coerced or were they cooperating? Were they truthful in their translations, or were they doing their own thing with ulterior motives, like to do their own thing? Because remember, interpreters are very powerful cultural brokers, and they can make moves and they can control things. Which brings us to the next point. One of the Roanoke interpreters actually goes home. He goes back to sleep in his community, and the English absolutely panic. They treat it like a jailbreak. And that, of course, makes me wonder, how voluntary was this? You act like he's a friend and, he's really a prisoner. What is going on here? Right? And so you can see how frightened the English were of this man once he was out of their control. They really were very paranoid about what he might be saying to other people, like to local people about them. And this is true all through the European explorers. They were very paranoid of anyone that had been to Europe getting out of their control and telling the local community what they had seen. And so it seems to me, for my research at this time period, that interpreters were only good if they were 100% under your controls at all times, basically like a prisoner. And I'd also like to mention Frobisher. Frobisher has an example that shows how very low the standards of what constituted an interpreter could be. Things were so desperate, Frobisher was using a man as an interpreter that he had kidnapped 2 weeks ago. We're saying 2 weeks, and this man is suddenly treated like a real interpreter. So there is so much uncertainty surrounding the spoken language interpreters. And I just want to point out here that we can't assume that just because somebody spent some time with the English, that their English speaking skills would become passable. I think we have to be very careful about that. All right, so I could go for hours on this subject, but I think we've reached the conclusion now, my friends. The initial phase of makeshift communication basically has been largely glossed over by researchers, but you guys can tell tonight that it can and it should be studied. We can see glimpses of how the mechanics of early communication functioned. We can even see specific limitations that should be given more consideration. And we definitely should not be taking the translations of explorers at face value anymore. But I just want to clarify a few things before we end. I'm not trying to say that it's impossible to study these histories now and that we can't ever know anything ever again because there's so many unknown variables. I'm also not saying that communication was impossible. Clearly some communication was possible. Maybe the answer's somewhere in the middle, who knows? And I'm not saying that anyone now has to come along and figure out the real truth of what are the identities of these groups and, what were people doing and saying and what's the real history here. What I am trying to say is that this all needs to be given a deeper consideration. We need deeper thought about the early language barrier and how it affects our understanding of these histories. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tabitha. Now we're going to move over to our question period. Can we go to the full gallery now, please, Michelle? So we welcome your questions. I would in advance ask you to either put your hand up or you can use the chat function. And when we acknowledge you, please unmute so of course we can hear you. So let me call for questions. Dawn Richardson, please go ahead.
So Tabitha, I found the whole presentation extremely fascinating. Thank you very, very much. I've always been curious to know when the Europeans, whether they were French or Spanish or English, when they came, you mentioned them using the names Hochelaga and Stadacona. How did they come upon these names? Did they hear names from the First Nations people and then reinterpret them as they heard them and then therefore give them to the place names to them? And then the second part of that, you refer to, we know First Nations people as Huron, Ojibwe, Cree, Assiniboine, and so on. How did those names originate? Again, was that a European invention, a construct, or is that what the First Nations people refer to themselves as?
I want to say I am very sorry for not using the names of certain regions and certain people appropriately. I'm working in the 1500s with how the Elizabethans were speaking about them. I think there's a lot of mystery around this. A very famous story is when the English went to Roanoke and said, this is the name of this land, they thought they heard it from local people. And then I don't know if this is true or not. It's sort of a legend that's gone back for 500 years, but they said, oh, that actually means you wear funny clothes. You might have heard that one before. I'm not sure how true that is. And also the Cartier business with Canada, right? Yeah. Canada, actually, they're here in Canada. Now, I want to say that actually predates Cartier. I don't know where these things came from. We see Canada just showing up in the French writing. We're assuming it came from the fishermen. We're not exactly sure, but it definitely was. It was before Cartier that Canada started being used, and maybe it did come from the village. But essentially, let's take Roanoke and Croatoan. They were just kind of guessing based on the sounds they were hearing Indigenous people say, and it could have been completely wrong. I think some of these terms may have been negotiated even. If both sides felt like they were getting traction and something was working, that's how you create a pidgin language. That's suddenly the new word for it because it's getting results, it's working. So honestly, I can't really answer your question, Dawn. I think there's a lot of mystery around this, but the English were making a huge amount of assumptions about who people were, what their names were, who lived where their territory was. I think all of that was conjecture, and I think we need to be very careful about it. I'm not sure, and I can't speak to later periods, though. Some of your question would belong to later periods. I don't know if that helped at all.
Sure.
It's difficult. It's difficult to answer that.
Thank you.
Questions?
Terry wants to answer that. Go ahead, Terry Lynn.
Yeah, thank you, Tabitha. That was great, and I loved how you focused on just that, the faux pas of the English, and French, writings of the time, and I think it's and I'm going to come to your question, Don, but it's really important as well for me whenever I think about that, those interpretations that the Europeans gave on the communication that was happening when they were engaging new people from over here. It also was stemming from what was happening back home. And so when you're seeing about the witchcraft and that deception and that nervousness and that right away concern of bad things happening, that's because at home that was happening all the time, right? There was all of this, the Salem, the witch trials that translated and came over to the New World. So a lot of that deception, you've got the religious issues and everything that was coming out about the Reformation and everything else. So I mean, it's all just very timely as to what people were coming from, because I thought it was really interesting when you started off by the conversation of the recognition of sporting events that the Europeans picked up on. And yet they would walk in and hear these sounds coming out of folks when they were first kind of walking into spaces. And we now, you know, in the Inuit culture, throat singing and guttural sounds back and forth was actually a game. It is a game. It's a game between women that occur in regards to seeing who can, and it's like, it's the earliest form of rap, right? It's women would compete against each other to see who can beat each other with their singing, with the guttural singing, and the men used to mimic it as well. So I mean, you know, how in English interpretation never knew that was a game, so they would just go, well, that's weird, you know. So I mean, we have to be really cognizant of the worldview that people were coming from, and how the nature of even religion wasn't, you know, that doesn't translate to North American thoughts. And all you have to do is pick up, you know, here, like our Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace, and you'll right away read that all of that initial conversation of so much information, the British just didn't think that the New World people were capable of that level of intelligence. And so you right away started to get that inferior superior understanding. And then that scripted, you know, nose, boot, you know, understanding, because that's all they think the conversations would extend to.
Yeah.
As for your questions, Dawn, about the understandings, many of the titles you said, yes, they are the anglicized or francophone interpretations of what people were hearing, the Europeans were hearing. It's only when you start to get to our languages. So Anishinaabe is an Ojibwe term, meaning the original peoples. And so that is the actual language and the term that would have been used all along. But Ojibwe, that's English. Cree, that's English. Huron is French. Iroquois is French. None of those terms were from our language. Haudenosaunee, that's our language. You know, so it's understanding the differences there that have been picked up. But Canada's really great about the sense that we do have many cities that are Indigenous names and titles still. We have a huge percentage of them, and people don't often realize that. Thanks. I'll shut up now.
Questions? Well, Tabitha, let me put one to you. If I were a shrewd lawyer working for an Aboriginal land claim, I'd call you as my first witness, because what you've told us is that this quicksand of incomprehension would be reflected in the treaties that were signed, admittedly, further on in the 19th century. But what you've given us is a portrait of people who quite often didn't understand the concepts behind what they thought they were talking about and what the other side was talking about. There was a cultural gap in terms of things like property, communal or individual, etc. So your testimony, I think, would be a very strong case for revisiting the treaties as an unequal negotiation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have too much to add to that, but yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Like in the dissertation, I had to do a whole, and it's right to do a whole section of the background context that creates the preconceived notions and these underlying perceptions that creates the lens or the filter through which people were translating things. Expectations are huge when you go into a situation and you think that, you know, this is my property, I can put fences around things, this is how the world works, you know. So yeah, I think you're right. I don't have too much to add to what you said.
Questions, please.
There was a question that came in from Kelly Duncan in the chat. I can read it out. Kelly was wondering if you have worked with Indigenous knowledge keepers to find out how their teachings align with some of those same stories from the British perspective, etc.
I have not, but if I were to continue this project, that would be an awesome thing to do. I think the Inuit oral history in particular was very helpful. It was very helpful because there's less broken transmission and it's been passed on for hundreds of years. And so we can still see impressions of contact and these sort of things. And so that would definitely be something to do if I were to carry the project on, for sure.
Michelle.
I have a question. I was curious about the images that you use. I know you referenced a few of them of like who the artist was, but I was wondering if you could just speak a bit more about the visual aspect that you provided. It's great collection of various different sketches and drawings.
All right, so basically I want to make a correction of myself. First of all, some of the labels I wrote Francis Black, and that's why I pronounced his last name so carefully at the start of the presentation. It's Francis Back that painted those two pictures, and they were of the Frobisher's first expedition. As for the rest of them, everything else was painted by John White, an Elizabethan, in either the 1570s or the 1580s. So the paintings that he did at Roanoke, anything that's not of the Inuit, is basically painted at Roanoke of the Carolina Algonquin, or at least his interpretation of them. And so, you know, I don't know how much more you want me to say about that, but it's interesting. Like there's lots of, he was trying to show what they looked like and, you know, how they prepared food and different things like that. And then he had pictures of the Inuit. One of those pictures was showing a skirmish that happened, unfortunately, a tragic event, but one of them showed a skirmish. And then the other pictures showed 3 captives that were taken, a man, a woman, and her baby that were taken in 1577. They're shown in the pictures, and they were brought back to England, and they did not survive and were kind of treated like a human zoo exhibit. And I didn't really get to talk much about that, about how the English kind of put the man and the woman together like they were strangers. They were taken from different regions. They put them together and they wanted to see what they would do, as if they were putting 2 lions in a cage together, and they're like, oh, I wonder if they'll breed. That's the way they were talking, and they wanted to watch them. And then when they take them back to England, they're like, put his boat in the water and let him show everybody how his boat works. You know, so it's definitely very uncomfortable. It's this human zoo element of this, the zookeeper watching them, very uncomfortable, but I think very important for us to remember and to reflect on, that this is how people were being treated, for sure. So that's what I think of when I think of the paintings. And I think you can even see on the Inuit woman's face, her beautiful blue tattoos, you know, and it's just, yeah, no, I think that White was trying to depict how these people looked because they didn't have a camera, and he wanted to say, you know, this is what they look like to the rest of Europe. But sorry, I don't know if that helped.
No, it did. I guess my follow-up would be, so this was public consumption. It wasn't simply, you know, his own reflections, observations. It was, they were being shared publicly. Yeah,
it was. And then engravings were made of them so they could be mass produced. And when they made the engravings, they're slightly changed, but they made them so that they could be printed, so that they could be like mass sent out. I mean, the British Museum has the originals. They have them right now. But there's so many copies floating around that were just turned into engravings and stamp, mass produced, so that people all over Europe could kind of see. And some of them I didn't include. Some of them were showing different indigenous tattoos, and the English had no idea what they meant, but they were just showing, okay, this one looks like this one looks like that, and they'd have a page of like 8 of them. And I just find that very interesting. I mean, there's so much I couldn't talk about. Thomas Harriot also went as a scientist on the Roanoke expeditions, and was trying to figure out the language to the point where he was trying to create an alphabet. And he was trying to write down every plant and animal. And so they were trying to catalog all of this, because Walter Raleigh kind of thought he wanted to succeed where the others had failed. You know, if Davis thought that, you know, being lenient would help, Raleigh thought that knowledge was the answer and was the key to empire. Was the more that we learn and the better we can speak, then we'll have a chance at this. Of course, they have their own unfortunate ulterior motives for wanting to get to know Indigenous people better. But yeah, there's just hours that I could talk about here. But yeah, I hope that helps, Michelle.
No, thank you. Vincent.
Questions, please. Vincent, please unmute. Thanks.
Okay, I had to figure out where the button was. Very good, Tabitha. Really enthusiastic. I like your style. Do we know from the other side, do we know what the interpretation from the Indigenous people was of the French, the English, the Dutch, whatever? And did they have, you're going to have to help me here. I know that they didn't have what we would call written language, but did they keep any records of their interpretation of these Europeans? And were they doing something similar in that they were analyzing these people and spreading that around, saying, hey, you should see what happened over here? You see what I'm getting at here?
Yeah, to answer this in two parts, unfortunately, I should have said the Carolina Algonquin are no longer with us. They were, unfortunately, to be blunt, a victim of contact. It's horrible to talk about a people this way, but they went extinct directly due to contact. They were just totally overwhelmed by pestilence, and the English knew it was them right in the moment. They wrote about it. They said every town we go to, they get plague. And so it's awful. So unfortunately, the Carolina Algonquin and they're doing DNA studies now to see if their DNA has been continued on through other populations, but the language, the culture, and different things like that, we can't find in that space. To get back to the Inuit, though, their oral history is incredible. It's incredible, especially and archaeological finds as well. Archaeological finds show all sorts of material culture from the 1500s Europe, right? 16th century Europe. But more importantly, the oral history of the Inuit. They describe through their stories encounters with Europeans, mostly the Norse, but they describe their experiences. And do you know what I inferred from it? They don't directly say these people were like this, but in the stories, you get the impression that they thought that the Norse were, very proud, arrogant people to the point of foolishness. Most of their stories involve Norsemen being so competitive and being so, like they're talking about Vikings here, being so competitive that they accidentally kill themselves. Do you know what I mean? Like this is sort of the nature of these stories, and they're absolutely fascinating if you can look them up. So much has survived from Greenland in this capacity. And so, yeah, I mean, they describe being friends with the Norse, and they also describe fighting with the Norse. They describe both, and definitely the foolishness is at the forefront of my mind. There seems to be a lot of foolishness. The Inuit feel there's foolishness and a mix of cowardice and arrogance, really. I wish I had time to tell you some of the stories, but they'd say, the first time we ever happened upon these people, they were so scared of us, they ran out on the ice and they fell through the ice and died. Like, how foolish is that? And another time they'll tell a story, we came upon them, and we knocked on the side of their tent and they were so scared they died of fright. They were so scared of us. Or, another story, they'll be like, oh, there was a Norseman and his best friend was an Inuk, and the two of them, they love to do archery contests together. And the Norseman says, if I miss this shot, I'll jump right off the cliff. And, the Inuk says, please don't do that. That's really dumb. Why would you do that? And then he says, no, I'm going to do it. And he misses the shot. And then his people say, no, he needs to die now. He's let us all down, and it's his own foolish, because the Inuk turns to the community and says he doesn't really have to do it. And the Vikings are like, no, he has to do it. And so who knows, exactly how much of this is exaggerated or not. There's many stories like this. There's also a cycle that shows kind of the justice idea between these two people. There's an accidental killing, and then both sides kind of kill back and forth over and over again until they feel like justice is finally worked itself out. That sort of, I find these oral histories just so fascinating. But sorry, I got off on a tangent there, Vincent, but I'm basically saying that if you look at the Arctic, you'll see archaeology and oral history that will go back, so far, like 1,000 years. You know what I mean? It'll go back to the Norse 1,000 years ago.
Thank you.
That was one of the ways that Shackleton was tracked. The oral history came down through the generations, recording the fact that Inuit had encountered a group of white men foolishly dragging this boat over the ice with the wardrobe silver in it, dressed inadequately, and they apparently critically remarked on what the hell are these people doing? They're not in tune with the environment they're in. By contrast, the oral history talked about the Norwegians they encountered, and the Norwegians said, "What are you wearing? That looks warm. Let us try it on," etc. So they could differentiate between Europeans. But as you say, you're quite right. The oral history provided some of the clue to what happened to Shackleton.
Yeah, Franklin as well. The Inuit always knew.
I'm sorry, I meant Franklin. Yes.
Yeah, they knew where the ship was. Do you know what I mean? Like, and so that's very interesting. Yeah, but even like in terms of Frobisher, the Inuit had said for a very long time, Europeans came to that island. They had a house there. They came to this house I'm telling you about. It survived through Inuit oral history, and they knew. They named that island after that's the place the white people were. Do you know what I mean? Like something to that, I'm paraphrasing, but something to that extent, right? So, I mean, we need to listen to this. The more of this that comes forward, we're gonna learn more and more about what we think is lost is not really lost at all. And the archaeology is so fascinating. People are saying, oh, you know, how did this get here? You know, and we're like, because they had trade networks that went so far. And not only that, we know that the English now were there decades earlier than we ever thought they were. The Bristol men were probably the 1480s, before Columbus, they were encountering Indigenous people, right? And so this is all stuff that'll eventually catch on. It maybe hasn't made it to the school curriculum yet, but academics have known since the 50s that contact is so much earlier than Columbus. That kind of stuff. But yeah, there's so much to say about the oral history and the archaeology and all this really, really cool stuff. It's very important.
I heard told to me by the photo archivist at the National Archives in Ottawa, they have a massive collection of RCMP photos from the North, dating from the 30s, 40s to the present. And the photos were all captioned Sergeant Smith and Corporal Brown and 2 Eskimos. And they got funding in the 1980s to take the photos north to find out who the 2 Eskimos were. And they spent time in the villages and talking to people, and they were able to identify them. And the photos came back with a caption on them, Esker John and Inuguk and 2 white men.
Oh, that's so interesting.
You know, the cultural incomprehension came through right to the present.
Sorry, there was a question from Terry Lynn, I think. I haven't looked at the texts of the Sami, but I should. There's so much. This project could go forever, and I really hope, because I was teaching it to my students, I really hope that others are just going to pick up all the different pieces and keep going and going and going, because it could go forever and it can go in all parts of the world. You know what I mean? And all of these things, there's language barriers everywhere. There's Indigenous people everywhere. And it's interesting. And I never even got to talk about the fact that Frobisher was one of the few Englishmen that had ever been to Africa before in this period. And he was actually taken captive by Africans. And this gave him the idea that it was okay to capture the Inuit. You know, so there's just so much to say about this. But I don't know if you wanted to add anything further, Terry, about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, no, that would be great. I mean, I would love to hear if you had a chance to look at the Sami text, because I was just going to type, I've engaged and worked with a few Sami in the theater world over the last few years, and they go back on Greenland. They've actually been on Greenland for hundreds of years. So because the Sami covered all of that northern Scandinavia to Iceland to Greenland for time immemorial. So that's where, you know, the difference between getting to the Inuit, the Innu, and then the Sami and Greenland, there was all of this mix of cultural diversity there that goes back 1,000, 2,000 years as well. So the oral history, I think in there, like they have some good records in Norway right now from some of those early texts. So yeah, you need to get a flight, go on over when pandemic's gone.
Yeah, I'm just a beginner. I'm just a beginner in all of this, but I wanted, like I always told my supervisor, I'm just trying to get it started. I'm trying to get the ball rolling, because for 500 years we assumed we knew the answers, and no, we should start over probably. We should start over in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. Let's just start over now. You know what I mean? From scratch. Let's start over. And I'm just a baby in all this.
I'm with you.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. It's awesome if we learn and grow together and figure some of these things out. It'd be wonderful. And I do think that there's plenty of work for anyone that's interested to want to learn and research and grow. Like if somebody takes all of these different encounters, there's so many different encounters you can look at all over the world, then there's just so much we can learn about humanity in general. It's just really cool. I think it's cool, and I think it's important. It's a methodological project, really. Like when I started this, I'm like, when I say methodology, I mean kind of the historian's craft, the method of the historian. I was kind of like, okay, the historian needs to relearn how to look at these narratives. We need to start over here, right? And so that's what the project was. But then once you get into it, you're like, oh my goodness, if any of this is different, then it's going to change what we call the historiography, which is the stories, the history. Our stories are suddenly going to change if any of this stuff changes, like our methods, right? And so I always get asked, you're deconstructing to the point of crisis. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I'm just saying that we should just revisit this. And, it doesn't hurt to try to be more honest and more transparent and more open. And, I don't think deconstruction is a bad thing. I think there's no harm in being more honest about what you know and what you can't know. You know what I mean? I've always wanted to be more honest about what I can know and what I don't know. So there we go. Hooray.
Michelle, did you have a question on chat there? No, okay.
Sorry, Tabitha picked it up. It was from Terry.
Okay. Any other questions, folks? Well, in that case, I'd like to call on Peter Gower to thank our speaker tonight. Peter?
Well, thank you, Duncan. Dr. Renaud, congratulations. When I was watching you before we started, I had never seen you as nervous as you were sitting there. Not quite shaking, but, it was getting that way. And you had absolutely no reason to worry about that, despite the complexity of the subject. And I must admit, I was wondering what you were going to do with visuals. And thank you, Michelle, for asking about them, because I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I've never sat through a presentation where the pictures had absolutely nothing to do with what was going on and yet helped all the way through. It's interesting because a common theme that we've had in the emails from non-members asking to hear you tonight has been, well, how do you start communicating with people when you've got no common language? And I think you've elaborated that even further, and to say that it's not only not a common language, but it's not an understanding of signs, of actions, of any number of things which can be so easily misinterpreted. I often wondered personally how the missionaries managed to talk to the Inuit about shepherds watching their sheep through a December night. Absolutely. Well, they did it somehow. When I worked in an African school, I had many different first languages spoken. And it was fascinating to watch young children work out how to communicate with each other. It really can be done, but I never understood how it worked. I've also watched, and a couple of things that came to mind as you were talking, watch animals meeting for the first time. I shouldn't talk about your dog because you lost it the other night, I know. But two dogs meeting for the first time and how they approach each other, and wondering if that's what we do when we find somebody that we've never seen before. Similarly, you talked about actions which get misinterpreted. I had to learn in East Africa how to shake hands with people because it's different, and it's suddenly realized all these little things. But what a wonderful evening. I'm sure we're all going to go away looking and wondering however it really worked and how it could have been done better and the awful things that happened, because we whites knew exactly what we were saying and they didn't. And now realizing that they had exactly the same thoughts in their mind. So thank you so much for such a wonderfully well-presented talk. And now all of us are virtually applauding you. So thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you very much. Tabitha, thank you very much. And Michelle, once again, thank you very much for making this all work smoothly. Let me draw your attention quickly to our next talk. Our next lecture will engage the topic we've been looking at of the ever-shifting boundaries of inclusion in our society. On Wednesday, May the 12th, same time, 7 o'clock on Zoom, we will be joined by Queen's Archivist Heather Home and Kingston community activist Janice McAlpine, who will discuss their collaboration in building an archive that captures the historical experience of the Kingston LGBTQ community. A project to bring people on the margins of the majority society into the cognition of that society, and at the same time, give them a sense of public identity. So that will be on Wednesday, the 12th of May, and Paul will send out the Zoom invitation at that time. Please join us that evening. And as Vincent mentioned briefly at the beginning, yeah, we are working on next fall's presentation, and it looks, I think, quite promising. If you're interested in why the people on Wolf Island speak differently, we'll have a lecture on that. If you're interested in the prominent Dutch community here in Kingston, we hope to have a lecture on that. And we also have to have a more, I think, traditional lecture on the very brilliant connection of Norman MacLeod Rogers, cabinet minister, Kingston MPP, and our community here in Kingston. But we'll have more about that in May. So in the interim, thank you once again for coming. Thank you, Tabitha, again, and good night, everybody. Thank you.